Good afternoon. I am Kelly Brown Douglas, Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary here in New York City. Thank you for joining us for another in our series of Just Conversations, where we engage issues of racialized inequities intrinsic to our nation, as well as our collective responsibility to create a more just future. Today's Just Conversation is another in a series of conversations with members of a cohort of 12 scholars, faith leaders, artists, and activists who have come together in a project sponsored by the Henry Luce Foundation grant to reflect on religion and racial justice, expanding the immoral imaginary through film, and to share their work and research. It is my great pleasure to welcome to this conversation today two friends and colleagues. First, Dr. Jeremy V. Cruz, a social ethicist who serves as Associate Professor of Theology and Religious Studies at St. John's University in Queens, New York. His research investigates relationships between morality, public theology, and social movements. I also welcome Dr. Simran Singh, Executive Director of the Religion and Society Program at the Aspen Institute, and national best-selling author of The Light We Give, How Sikh Wisdom Can Transform Your Life. Simran is also visiting professor of history and religion at Union Theological Seminary. I want to thank both of you for joining me not only in the religion and racial justice cohort, but also in this conversation.
Thank you.
I want to jump right into this conversation with an issue that is becoming more pressing in this country today, and that is white Christian nationalism. While white Christian nationalism is certainly not a new phenomenon in this nation, there are certain times when it explodes onto the public square with vigor, typically times when white Christians feel that they are under attack by non-white Christians. And so perhaps it's no accident that at a time in this country where there is a racial, ethnic, demographic shift, thus a decline in the white population while racial ethnic groups increase, white Christian nationalism has indeed exploded once again with violent intensity up on our public square. Can the two of you first speak to what you find most challenging, if not dangerous, with this explosion, and what impact this has had on the work you do? Start with you, Simran.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate the question, and it's funny to be in a position where many minoritized people often find themselves, which is, hey, we've been telling you about this problem for a long time, and if you had just paid attention, we wouldn't end up where we are. And so I think this is not just true coming from people who have experienced this from a position of lived experience. It's also, I think, the experience I've had as a scholar of religion, especially one who has been paying attention to American religious trends. And, so many people for the past few decades have been saying, well, religion is on the decline. America is becoming more secular. We don't need to pay attention to what people believe anymore. It doesn't matter so much. And I think what we've been witnessing is the falsehood of that assumption, and there's a clear bias in there too, right? And we need to really grapple with the biases that have led us to ignore some realities that have been sitting under our nose for a long time now. And so in terms of where we are, I mean, I'm troubled, yes. Am I surprised? Not really. And I don't think many of us who have been paying attention are surprised. But I think what's been a bit unexpected for me has been how quickly, as the white nationalist movement has turned violent and really threatened the stability of American democracy. I mean, in really serious ways, even now, people are quick to dismiss the potential threat, the magnitude of the problem, and I think it's because they see it as anomalous, perhaps because they want to and don't want to acknowledge the depth of the problem that's fomenting underneath the surface. And that's sort of been how we so often have approached social and political challenges in this country, right? We'll say, well, we don't want racism to exist anymore, so we're just going to pretend like it doesn't, and ignore the deeper systemic issues. But ignoring it has often led us to a place of real pain. And that's where we are right now. In terms of your question about how it's affected my work, I think in some ways it's actually really elevated the work. And what I mean by that is for a long time, people weren't paying attention to these kinds of issues. Whether it's on the basis of racial difference or religious difference or whatever it is. And now I think we're in a place as a society where we can't really ignore the significance of religion in how it shapes people's worldviews, how it affects our politics, and the need to take it seriously. So that's really from every aspect of my work, whether it's in my teaching or my writing or my activism or so on, it's had a significant impact across the board.
Yeah, and I want to get back sort of to that and the new voices that are not new voices that are emerging, but voices that are now perhaps being listened to as we see this violent explosion of white Christian nationalism. But Jeremy, your thoughts?
When I think of Christian nationalism, and I'm thinking from within the Christian tradition and thinking and living primarily out of the Catholic tradition, I think of Christian nationalism as a politics, but also as a moral orientation or a moral imagination. And I also think of Christian nationalism as a theology or a theocratic religious imagination as well. There are very clear theological underpinnings. So on the one hand, I can think of the politics and think of what's at stake and the dangers of Christian nationalism for all of us, Christian and non-Christian, the threats to democracy, the attempt to override the will of the people through election access or through undermining the results of elections in order to, advance an agenda that's viewed as more righteous because it's Christian or a particular brand of Christian. There's a clear danger to democracy. There's a clear danger to public safety, as Simran has addressed. And that's not only in the form of hate crimes against, targeting non-Christian religious communities, attacks on places of worship, Sikh, Muslim, Jewish, etc. But there's also a confluence, and this shouldn't really surprise us, but a convergence, between really extreme advocacy for individual gun ownership rights and Christian nationalism. And we see every day, we're already on pace in April to smash, in this year to smash the record for, a record we don't want to smash for mass shootings in 2023. We're on a really scary pace. And the fear that motivates that theological imagination, that moral imagination, and that politics has always been a fear that also seeks to make guns as available as possible to those advancing that politics, while at the same time, hypocritically, not available to those who oppose that tradition. So, from the beginning of the country, the Christian nationalist imagination that fueled the colonial spread of this country, indigenous people could not own guns. Black people who were not citizens could not own guns. A lot of people could not own guns. The people who could own guns were those who shared the Christian nationalist imagination and the Manifest Destiny project. I also think of the what's at stake in the politics is obviously threats to very intimate personal decisions and to personal autonomy, whether it's attacks on our gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender neighbors, threats to reproductive health, basic medical care access, so threats to democracy, threats to public safety, threats to personal autonomy. But then for me as a Christian, there's a lot at stake theologically and ethically in terms of what do we understand as Christians? What do we understand it to mean to walk in the Spirit of God? And what do we understand it to mean to be followers or students, disciples of Jesus in public? The Christian nationalist has a very different imagination and understanding of what it means to follow Jesus and what it means to walk in the Spirit than I do. And so there's something at stake within my tradition as well.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I appreciate the connections that both of you are making between white Christian nationalism and politics and what the politic of it all, right? And what's really going on in our public square, the attack on democracy, and all of the concomitant issues that involves, right? Power over certain persons, like women's bodies, guns, et cetera, et cetera. How do we get others, one, to see that connection, that this isn't white Christian nationalism? Some people don't want to call it white Christian nationalism. They just want to call it Christian nationalism. Whatever it may be, that Christian nationalism is almost the sacred canopy over which that allows these other things to take place, and that the sacred canopy over the sort of attack on democracy, attack on people's rights, attack on minoritized persons. How do we help others to see that connection? What is the role, if you will, of religious scholars, as both of you are, as religious leaders? How do we begin to make those connections for the public and hopefully begin to change the narrative?
You want me to go first this time, Simran? In my teaching, at least, I've really made it a point in every single one of my classes, because my primary teaching area is in the Christian tradition, to have units on the origins of Christian anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, because it's very often the case that the Christian nationalist imagination and the theology and ethics goes with it are closely tied to the origins of a anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic religious and racial imagination. So part of the task that I see for myself as a scholar working within the Christian tradition is to help students, Christian and non-Christian alike, be able to recognize and name Christian anti-Judaism and Christian anti-Semitism when they see it, and to understand the various facets of it, but also then to be able to identify how those logics get replicated and reproduced in how Christians sometimes relate to other traditions. So I find myself, talking about both the origins, even within the Christian scriptures, of certain lines of thinking about the relationship of Jewish people to their covenant relationship with God, Christian understandings of salvation, but also more contemporary kind of 20th century concepts like, the evolution of this term that we often hear thrown around in the US, the Judeo-Christian tradition, right, or the Judeo-Christian foundations of this country. And it's a term that carries a lot of baggage. It's complicated. It has both kind of liberal Christian attempts at inclusion, but also a really checkered history of exclusion and marginalization, especially of Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, people identified as being outside of the people being constructed as being somehow new arrivals and outside the religious mainstream of the United States, which is usually actually not the case. Usually the religious traditions targeted are traditions that have been here from the beginning of this country or from very, very early stages. I think that that's important, but it's also not just about ideas, it's about practice. It's about having our co-religionists, so to speak, be able to see and identify with the practice of interfaith relations and participation in a vision of what I like to call interfaith America, not seeing the religious fabric of this society as Judeo-Christian, whatever that means, however problematic that phrase is, but interfaith. And when I say America, con acento, with accent, I mean thinking transnationally, thinking about how religion and interfaith solidarity transcends not only the borders of our congregations, but the borders of the nation state, and how our relationships and our interconnection across those borders really matters.
So, Simran, I want to add, as you answer this question, pick up from something that Jeremy just said, and that's the interfaith, interreligious realities of the nation. At the one hand, we talk about being an interfaith, interreligious nation. The other hand, we aren't interfaith and interreligiously just, right? So how do we get there? And what does that look like? And given all that Jeremy has just said, yes, this has, we know Christian nationalism has been always embedded within our foundation with many problematics. Yet we also know that more than Christians have inhabited this nation from its very beginnings. And so we will argue all the time that we're an interfaith, interreligious nation, but we really aren't. We aren't at least interfaith and interreligiously just. So how do we get there?
Yeah, I love it. And Jeremy, I love what you were just talking about, because I mean, I'm a firm believer in, and Kelly, I've seen this through your work too. We can't get very far if we're not being honest about our reality. And I don't think as a culture, we have been very honest. I mean, about the history of what the white Christian nationalist movement looks like, but also the present and what the challenges are. I mean, as you were saying, Kelly, like so many people want to say, well, this is just a white nationalist movement. So many people want to say it's a Christian nationalist movement. And one of the aspects that gives me hope is that our understanding of the problem is becoming more clear. 10 years ago, if you said that I could talk in front of a crowd of people and use the term white supremacist or whiteness, I'd say no way. Like I know what that is as a scholar of this stuff, but no one would understand what I was talking about and people would shut down. And now that's different, right? Like people understand these concepts. And I think one of the real opportunities we have is to use these frames that we've developed and really start to push on them to create an even more clear understanding, right? So we're able to talk about white supremacy. We're not yet able to talk about religious supremacy. And I think we can get there, and we can get there very soon, despite the resistance to from people often who are trying to defend whatever it is that they hold dear from their positions of privilege and power. And part of so that's part of the answer to your question of how find the places where we have been successful in creating change and understanding, and using those frameworks to further the understanding. The other thing I want to say here is to your question, Kelly, about how do we move beyond Christocentric frameworks. It's my experience that it's very difficult to see your bias, especially when it's coming from a place of privilege. And there has to be both a willingness to introspect and to see it, but also oftentimes you need people to help you see the way. Both of those take a level of humility, right? The introspection and the reception from others. And I don't think culturally we have much humility, in part because of our, what capitalism and hyper-individualism demand of us. But also because we now live in a society where it's so difficult to admit that you're imperfect, that you have any shortcomings. And so I think a precondition for a cultural shift in which we would be able to really be honest and learn about our own shortcomings, the privileges that we have, the reality that there are some people in this country who have advantages that other people don't, right? On the basis of race, yes, we are understanding that. On the basis of religion, we don't really talk about that, right? How hard is it to live in this country and not be a Christian, whether you're a Muslim, whether you are a Hindu, whether you are an atheist? I mean, we don't know how to talk about that yet. So I think there's an infusion of humility that we require in order to start moving those conversations forward.
May I
So,
respond to that, Kelly,
yes,
before we move on?
yes,
So
of course.
I really appreciate that. And what I'm hearing, I use the phrase from Ibu Patel, Interfaith America. I put an accent on it, America, because I think it's important, just as Simran is saying, that we don't have a language for talking about religious domination. We haven't developed enough of one to talk about, we don't talk about citizenship as a form of hegemony or domination enough. We don't talk about citizenship as privilege, as systemic or structured dominance enough. And naming part of this ideology as nationalism, I think, opens up the opportunity to do that both in the religious sense as well as in the citizenship sense. And one of the critiques and the shortcomings of talking about Judeo-Christian, for example, is that, especially from Jewish people and Jewish leaders, there's this critique of the way that term kind of throws a blanket over a long history of Christian anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, and creates a kind of kumbaya unity term that is not historically rooted in, it's not rooted in any kind of like historical movement, for example, but also, so I think the word interfaith runs that same risk if by interfaith we don't also mean interfaith repentance, interfaith, dialogue, but also repentance, repair, restitution, really taking seriously the long history of conflict and domination between our traditions.
Yeah, I so appreciate that, and the recognition. When we say Judeo-Christian, it's this long history of Christian supersessionism, right, over Jewish traditions, and that's what that term, in so many ways, evokes. And also when we say interfaith or interreligious, I'm always wary of who's using that term, right? Because it reminds me of when we say diversity, but that just means representation. But and it's those like Christians who talk about an interfaith dialogue on their terms. And so I so appreciate what both of you are saying in this regard, as well as Simran, you give me hope in saying, 10 years ago, and you're right, we couldn't talk about white supremacy like this. We couldn't talk about whiteness. But now we're back to not being able to talk about race in the classroom. And I often borrow from Richard Rothstein, who said in his book, The Color of Law, that if we don't begin to change the story of our history and change the narrative, then we can't expect the next generation to be any better off than we are. And fostering racial justice, in particular, and social justice in general. And so now we have, as a part of this white Christian nationalist imaginary politic agenda, that race, any discussion of race is being banned from the classroom, and it really impacts the next generation. So as we wind down, this conversation can go on forever. So I do want to ask, we're part of a film cohort. What's the role of film in this, particularly in this time when we see race and our history being revised and certain books being banned in our classrooms? What's the role of film in helping us to change the narrative for the next generation and expanding our moral imaginary? Does it have a particular role now in this time? Either one of you can jump
Yeah, I mean, I'm Jeremy. I know you taught this course on
Right.
film. I'd love to hear how you're thinking about this question with regard to the classroom in particular. I mean, I'll just say, just to start off, and then Jeremy, to you. I mean, part of what's really killing me about the banning of books, and there's this free speech issue, which in and of itself creates a real pain in my heart around what it means to be free, and this question we've been essentially dancing around, which is who has power, right? Whether it's in the context of interfaith and who's at the center of those conversations, or otherwise, and in this context, what does we can have diversity and we can have representation, but will liberation come without power? I don't think so. And so what does it take to bring power to these communities? So anyway, I have more to say, but Jeremy, I'd love for you to take us into your classroom a little bit and your thinking as well.
Thank you, Simran. So I want to hopefully end on your returning to your thoughts on power, because it's something I've been wrestling with in our cohort, the role and the limits of the arts generally, film, but the arts generally. So I'll just share two things from my course. I showed the film, the Cesar Chavez film, the recent Cesar Chavez film, and put it in conversation with some scholarly religious studies texts about the long history of secularizing the image of, the most prominent Mexican American leader in U.S. history. There's a long history from left, center, and right of celebrating Chavez, but downplaying his religiosity, or critiquing Chavez, but critiquing him on his politics and ignoring the religious vision. And so as Chavez is being removed from primary and secondary school textbooks, it's been very rewarding to be able to introduce both Chavez and scholarly literature on, the depictions and various versions of Cesar Chavez that circulate within popular culture and popular political discourse, and a chance to show a brown Mexican American Catholic leader, someone who is not operating out of a vision of white Christian nationalism, and for my students who most of them didn't know anything about Chavez, and who associate Christianity in the United States with a right-wing white Christian nationalist politics. It was fruitful for them to see an alternative, and to see someone who himself was a very interfaith engaged leader. I also showed Bless Me Ultima, which we watched as a cohort, in part because the book by Rudolfo Anaya is one of the commonly banned books as there's been an attack on ethnic studies curriculum. The most common book or the most recognized book, a piece of Chicano literature, is Bless Me Ultima, and it has often been attacked for reasons of supposedly being anti-Christian or anti-Catholic for the colonial nationalists, because the book is a pretty direct critique of a anti-indigenous form of Catholicism, an anti, the book is an anti-colonial religious discourse. It's been banned. It's been targeted and banned for those reasons. So it's been rewarding to be able to show my students that film as well, and to talk about how that's been banned from a number of states' primary and secondary school curricula. At the same time, and coming back to Simran, to your point about power, if the arts are not just in conversation or talking about social movements, but being connected to and in service of the organizing and mobilizing of people. I think about the Young Lords and the Black Panthers newspapers in the 1970s, or I think about the United Farm Workers and El Teatro Campesino, the farm worker theater troupe that would travel to do popular education and to support the education of workers about their rights and about the farm worker organizing campaigns. There's so many examples of movement engaged arts, and if we're having conversations about the arts divorced from the social movements that are actually resisting white Christian nationalism and promoting a democratic interfaith alternative, then I think we're not doing enough in our engagements with the arts.
My goodness, we could go on and on, but we are at our time, and it's absolutely placed in, and I like this, the arts. How are the arts engaged and connected to these movements that allow for a change, expanding our moral imaginary on, yes, what justice looks like and what that means, how we begin to change our conceptions and realities of power. And Jeremy, as you point out, and it seems to me historically, we have often seen art movements related to these kind of movements for revolutionary change. I think of the Black Arts Movement, for instance, and others. So thank you both for this conversation. I know we are leaving it with people wanting more. And these are the kind of conversations that we have in our cohort of race and religion, expanding our moral imaginary through film. So I invite those of you who are listening to join us for our next conversation, and to as well join us as we do, and we'll do another public showing and viewing of a film in the fall. Thank you both for your participation in this conversation, and in this conversation, helping to expand my moral imaginary in terms of what is possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodness, we went past 30 minutes. I